Want your boss to put some real action behind the rhetoric when they talk about making your workplace more inclusive? Find out how to hold their feet to the fire to demand diversity on the Diversity Dude podcast with Reg Clark.
What's up, everybody? I am especially ready to keep this conversation moving today because I have a special guest. So I know that you guys are used to me not having a guest, but I wanted to bring in somebody who is a specialist, who is an expert in this field besides myself. So it's not just me talking, but you get an opportunity to hear a different perspective. So I'm going to bring in Dr. Artika Tyner, aka Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire. She's a passionate educator and award-winning author. She also does children's books. So if you have kids or you're an educator and you want to bring in books and talk about diversity and inclusion from an early stage, her books are excellent. I haven't read all of them, I'll be honest, but I have gone through her site to check it out, and there's some great things going on there. She's a civil rights attorney, sought after speaker, and she's dedicated for justice. She's a founder of the Planting People Growing Justice Leadership Institute. And I wanted to make sure I read from this because I didn't want to miss anything from her esteemed background. So I wanted to make sure I covered everything. And so now I would like to bring in Dr. Artika Tyner. How you doing, Dr. Tyner?
I'm well. Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here with you today.
Dr. Tyner, you have so many accolades. Is there anything that I missed that you would like to bring up?
I think the most important piece is that I've been a lifelong educator, committed to making sure that we engage in a learning process where we all can pause, reflect, and grow. So that's just been my life's mission. I think I started with my Barbie dolls and then elevated into becoming a professor, but continuing the work of education and learning is near and dear to my heart.
Great. Miss Dr. Tyner, I missed something there. And you are faculty or you are in a leadership position at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, correct?
I am. I'm the founding director of the Center on Race, Leadership, and Social Justice, and I'm also a law school faculty member.
Awesome. Talk a little bit about your position at St. Thomas and what you are charged with doing or accomplishing at St. Thomas.
I'm charged with training the next generation of social engineers, inspired by the words of Charles Hamilton Houston. Unfortunately, most people don't even know his name. But Dr. King described him as someone who helped to turn the civil rights movement and the pathway into a highway to freedom and justice. So Charles Hamilton Houston, in a legacy of decades of legal work, set the groundwork for the case today that we know as Brown versus Board of Education. But more importantly, really the spark for civil rights attorneys for generations, and reminding us that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. We never want to be in that latter category. So it means we have to work hard to be those public citizens, to be those folks who stand up for justice in meaningful ways. So I'm training and equipping our students to do just that through the legal research, through the writing, through the advocacy. How can they lift their voice for justice?
Do you feel that the students of today, this generation today, do you think they really understand what all of the social dynamics that are going on right now? Can your students see through that to a focal point that you're trying to get them to? Or are they distracted by all of the noise and the things that are going on today in society?
It's a powerful question and a great observation. I think, truth be told, whether it's social media that's available at our fingertips on our smartphone, radio, TV, there's information coming every direction. But the reality of it is, a part of our responsibility, especially for me as an educator, is to model the way. It's not just something I do in the classroom, it's a way of life. So things that I post, that I talk about, my students follow me in my personal and professional life, seeing how I model what I'm preaching. And that means that it's not just during classroom hours, outside of classroom hours. What is my research? What is it about? What are we seeking to accomplish? So I think a part of it is modeling and inspiring for students to go that extra mile, challenging them. When I post something, what do you see? The footnote, you see where it came from. It's not from another friend, just repost. It's coming from the source. So I think teaching and modeling the way has really ignited a passion in my students that my hope for the future is that they will continue to be those change agents.
So, Dr. Tyner, I know I am driving the producer, Shaletta, nuts right now because this conversation has the potential of going on for hours. I'm so fascinated by what you do. I just got your latest book. I just want to make sure everybody sees it. The Inclusive Leader, taking intentional action for justice and equity. I just got it yesterday. I want to thank you. I just received it, so I haven't had a chance to dive into it, but you and I are going to talk about it a little bit. But I want to back up a minute. And one thing that you mentioned was Dr. Martin Luther King. Do you have a favorite sermon of his or a favorite speech of his?
Oh, this is going to get tough. But one of my favorites is the drum major instinct.
Boom!
All my classes.
We are there. We are so there. And it's a speech for this time. And I've mentioned that on one of my previous podcasts. Please, in your words, tell us why the drum major instinct is an important speech.
Because it reminds us that we all can lead change. It reminds us that ordinary people, history has shown us that they can have an extraordinary impact if they're willing to serve, where they are. Oftentimes we think of a revolution or change being something at the magnitude of someone else, international, nationally. No, it starts in your household. It starts block by block, city by city, state by state. So really what it lays the foundation for is that you can no longer choose to remain idle. One of the things that Dr. King said is the most tragic thing that can happen is to sleep during a revolution. And I don't know about you, but I know it's revolutionary times. As we see the racial disparities, as we see the social justice challenges, the drum major instinct gives us a blueprint on how to move forward, that we each have an important role to play.
But you know what I love, what I've taken away, and again, when we go through these speeches, when we go through certain things, it's a personal experience that you have, right? And I absolutely respect what you said, and I agree with it. And I'm just saying, in my experience, not to and I think one of the things that is happening in discourse today is that we seek to devalue the other person's opinion to assert our own, right? And because you and I are evolved individuals, it's never that, right? Like you got a point and I'm like, that's great. So I don't want listeners to think that when I put my opinion in, it's to disregard yours. It's in addition to what you took away from that is that one of the greatest things was it was kind of like the first speech about servant leadership.
Agreed.
Right? About leading from behind, that you don't have to be out front. You don't have to, although we all want to carry that banner. And for any listener that's from an HBCU and knows what a drum major is, that's a whole different experience, right? That's a whole different experience. But the idea is servant leadership. So I would encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast or watching on YouTube to go to the University of Stanford where they have all of his speeches, or even on YouTube today where you can go and listen to all of his speeches and come up with your favorite one and be able to explain why it's your favorite one. And I think that's what's interesting about when I looked at your background and my background of being in diversity and inclusion for years. One of my things that I talk about in my podcast is diversity is that's the base. That's where we all get in at. Inclusion is what we're trying to achieve. And Dr. King really was talking about inclusion. How do we get included into this system? So when I look at your title, The Inclusive Leader, I go back to thinking about the drum major instinct, because to be an inclusive leader, in my mind, you have to be a servant leader as well. Talk about your book a little bit and how that ties into that.
Well, my book is mission driven. It's looking for an opportunity to inspire exactly what you're talking about. that message of Dr. King that we all can be impactful in meaningful ways. And in that same speech, The Drum Major Instinct, he says, if you want to be important, wonderful. So he's giving a sense of our human nature is to want to set the tone, to go forward and to be in the front. But really, the book is giving us a blueprint on how we can build that legacy, that sustainable change, that framework. So it goes through a 4-step process. It looks at through the framework that I introduced as my leadership framework, first looking at ourselves, understanding our own narratives around diversity and inclusion. For some, it's taboo. It's something that you don't talk about. You go, oh, we're all human, all are welcome, and the conversation's done. For others, this equity piece around inclusion is a part of their day-to-day life. I'm in that category. My work as a civil rights attorney, my work as an educator, my work as a nonprofit leader, focusing on the equity piece and how do we make it come alive. No matter where you find yourself, the one thing that is true, none of us are neutral in this analysis. We all have had experiences that are either been informed by biases, stereotypes, whatever it may be, prejudice, and we have to start unpacking that in order to see clearly.
What about those people in power who try to be neutral? And they try to be neutral by saying things like, I don't see color, right? So they're trying to put themselves in that neutral space. What do you say to those leaders?
I meet them in this next stage of that interpersonal piece of begging the question then, what does the data really say? You can't ignore the data. I mean, for us here, I'm in Minnesota, born and raised here in the Rondo community. And if you don't know anything about Rondo, our reality is that we are like over 1,000 cases across the nation, experiencing racial removal as a new highway infrastructure and freeway system went through the heart of African-American communities from the Gullah Geechee Nation in Florida, going to New Orleans, all the way to Baltimore, across, the United States. So when I think about that, when someone tells me that they're neutral or they don't see color, we see the reality of data. And maybe that's a lawyer in me that's bringing forth the data of the reality of the challenges that we face. My opinion, my story, you may try to deny that, but you cannot deny data. For instance, August, we have a lot of, monumental events, celebration. This week, we celebrated Women's Equality Day. How can we celebrate Women's Equality Day in good faith when African-American women have to work? We'll have to work all the way until next year, until August of 2022 to experience pay parity. For Latinas, all the way into November of 2022. Are we serious or are we not? So I think for those leaders that try to say, oh, I don't see color, all things are being equal, that's when we go to the color on the paper of the written data to help evaluate where we are and where we need to go.
Now that's awesome. I'm sure Shaletta's head just exploded because I don't know if you're familiar with the whole Rachel Nichols thing at ESPN and Maria Tyler, where the system pitted 2 women against each other for opportunity. We're going to take that off and we'll talk about that later. But what I do want to get back to is when you were talking about Rondo community. I lived in Minnesota for 10 years. I remember the Rondo days, festivals that they would have. But what didn't miss me was the thing that happened in Rondo also happened in Rochester, New York, where I grew up. There was a neighborhood called Clarissa Street, and they have a festival every year for the Clarissa Street. And that was before they drove the expressway through that part of town. In Buffalo, New York, there's the Humboldt Parkway before they drove the expressway through that. So what's happening is, and I think that we don't have an opportunity to really get together and commiserate, is that this is not unique to a neighborhood. This is part of a systematic and systemic process that has gone on. So when we talk about presenting data, I often say the data is only good as the audience that's receiving it. So how do you make sure that you have an audience that is going to walk away with actionable items? Because we've been talking about diversity for 40 or so years, and it seems like we're having the same conversation. If I showed you a diversity checklist from 1980 and I showed you a diversity checklist from 2021, would you agree that those probably the same action items are on both checklists?
Not only will I agree, I have my own case study. In one particular case, I went back to the early 1980s from 1980 on to about 1983 and look at the diversity plans and compare them to diversity plans in 2019, they were almost identical.
So in your book, what is it that you can offer that helps move that needle forward? And I often say that needle is driving us from diversity, which is a very basic concept. As a matter of fact, I've often said that diversity, that shouldn't be a goal because diversity is a natural happenstance. We're diverse just by our existence. But the needle needs to move not only to inclusion, but to acceptance. So what do you offer in your book? I don't want you to give it away because people need to buy the book. So what are you offering in your book that helps move them from the concept of diversity to inclusion and then acceptance?
What I offer in my book is a framework on how to do it. Instead of just saying we don't know what to do, we'll do another implicit bias training. Have you taken your IDI? How about your implicit association tests? These are things that, once again, if we look at the data, organizations have been doing for years. The reality of it is it's about results, the impact. And let's just be honest just for a moment. I've lived and worked all over the world. I'm just returning back from a trip to Africa. The reality of it is, if we are not able to make inclusion and equity and justice really come alive, it's the vitality of our economy, the future of our democracy. So it's much bigger things at stake than personalities and whether or not we like each other and can, sometimes we hear the example, play in the same playground. No, this is the reality of whether or not our economy will survive, because our economy is based upon what? The cultivation of human talent. And think about how many times, even from your personal experience, you've been left out of the conversation. Your ideas have not been a part of what is being created. More importantly, for me, my own experience, you're taxed with helping to address diversity issues. It exceeds the scope of your job, maybe your position, and even takes away and distracts from what you're really at work to do. So when we think about the culmination of all those issues, from the hundreds of folks that I've coached and taught around DEI issues, the question then becomes, can we continue on this path? And definitely not. So the book offers us some practical strategies on how to not just say what the challenges are, not just look at the data, but hold ourselves accountable to action and the type of action that will manifest and change.
So let me ask you this, Dr. Tyner. I'm a former VP of diversity and inclusion, and I used to always say that I was C-suite adjacent. Right. So there were the meetings that they had, and I was brought in either before the meeting or after the meeting. Right. So because I'd never really felt that I was really in that position to make the impact on the bottom line. And so when I say that, I think about companies like Google, Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, who still make tons of money, even though that their diversity and inclusion is not where they need to be. So Google, for example, several months ago, they took a Black female engineer out of her engineering position and just threw her in diversity and inclusion, right? So that, to me, that intimated that they weren't really serious. They just wanted to put a face to it because they continue to make billions, if not trillions of dollars. So how do we get a company to be sincere about it when they're making money in spite of being sincere about diversity and inclusion?
It's an excellent question, because it means that we have to shift attitudes and shift the culture. In some ways, you're starting to see it in the financial industry with investors demanding social responsibility. Primarily, they're looking maybe at environmental justice issues. But I think now, in many ways, it's looking at what are some of the racial justice, what are some of the gender equity issues. So I think a part of it is, once again, it's going to go back to what moves oftentimes the economy is looking at the dollars and cents of it all. And how do we make sure that the resources align with our values? And how do the values then align with these principles of inclusion in tangible ways?
Dr. Tyner, you and I could talk for, I guarantee you, we could do a marathon. We could be on here. We could probably break the Guinness record for a podcast, just going back and forth talking about this, but it's amazing and it's very interesting because we're really talking about how do you move the needle? How do you really progress and get us to the state that we all claim we want to be in, right? So the question that I posit and I want the listeners to think about as well is that when we talk about advancing diversity and inclusion, how do we make sure that it gets beyond the surface conversation and it becomes very actionable items? Before I met you this past week, my topic for today's podcast was going to really be, has the George Floyd effect worn off? Have organizations outlasted the outcry? And have they served enough? Have they served enough lip service to George Floyd? And have they invoked his name in enough ways to kind of weather the storm? So how do we make sure that whatever happened in the past 16, 18, 20 months, how do we make sure that that takes a stronghold for change in corporate America?
One of the tangible ways that I describe is ensuring that organizations in corporate America, they should be publishing their outputs. If we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what ways do we then manage progress and share updates? I mean, if we do annual reports on P&L, why are we not reporting out about DEI? Now, there are some case studies and examples that I give in the book about even corporate pay and evaluation being based upon some of these DEI metrics. We know from experience in any aspect of life, what we don't measure, we don't get results. So now is the time to do the measurements. Now is the time for it to be public. You're now seeing the outcry around board diversity, ensuring that corporate boards are diverse. And what is that going to take? Once again, making that data accessible. And some are reluctant and unwilling to. They're giving some cumulative data. Some are saying they're not going to provide data at all. They're just going to provide a DEI statement. At this point, is ensuring that that information is readily available, accessible. And I'll give you just one practical example that I'm working on as well. As we help to advance diversity in books, I founded a publishing company called Planting People Growing Justice Press and Bookstore. And our work has been about increasing diversity in books. Now everyone's talking about it. When I talked about it almost a decade ago, everyone said things that were highly offensive. Like, I'm not sure if they're the right consumers, saying, for instance, that people of color don't read. I'm not sure if we can have the capacity to do this. I'm not sure if the marketplace, but now all of a sudden my phone rings and everyone wants to hear my ideas and replicate what we were doing long before they stepped on the scene and started talking about diversity in books. Because it's a shame how in the world, with the cultural landscape of the United States changing so rapidly, and we'll see more when we get the rest of the census data, how is it you're more likely to see a book with on the cover of Black bear versus a Black girl, or a Black dog versus a Black boy? What is happening? So when we think about this, it can no longer afford to be fashionable. It can no longer afford to be in response to a crisis. Our work around inclusion has to be a part of our day-to-day life. And we have to have the data show it.
So I know that Shaletta's waist trainer is busting right now, but I'm going to keep going because I need to talk to you. I'm going to pay for that comment. But let's be honest, in full transparency, how long have we been talking about diversity on corporate boards? That's not a new concept, is it?
No, it's not.
So we've been having this conversation for so long, but we are failing to continue to push that needle forward. And I really admire you, and I admire the work that you do, and I admire your institute. Before I let you go, man, we could talk forever. Tell me a little bit about that beautiful Black superhero doll behind you.
Yes, it's in response to those pieces that I was talking about, inspiring young people around diversity and inclusion in some meaningful ways to say your story matters, you matter, and you can be that difference maker. You can be that superhero for justice. I didn't have a book like that when I was growing up. They threw a Black character just randomly into a couple of the chapter book series that I was reading. I didn't know about my history as an African-American beyond what I was taught. I didn't see it in the books. So I was determined. So nearly a dozen books later that I've written and helped over probably hundreds of other Black authors get their work off the ground. It was ensuring that instead of just saying, we'll wait, maybe the tides will change, we decided to be the change agents. We decided to then move forward with the charge of making sure that our children see the mirrors of themselves, the positive reflection of Black children in the pages of books, and for all children to have those windows to see into the cultural experience of others, to know that we can learn, grow, live, play together in some meaningful ways. But why are we not starting with sharing that message as early as when you start to read a book?
Awesome. So there's two things I want to do before we go. One is, what would be your message when I was a diversity practitioner before I got exhausted? And I used to have other diversity practitioners that I would talk to, and we used to have this little joke that we say, today I expect to get fired. Because like in moving this conversation forward, you knew that you were going to hit some nerves. So what would you say to diversity, HR practitioners, leaders who truly want to advance this thing of inclusion, get beyond diversity and get into inclusion? What words of encouragement would you offer to them?
I would remind them that, of course, this is a labor of love. It's not something that's going to win you the accolades, the praise that you're worthy of. I would remind them to make sure that they're taking care of their health and wellness. I've served in key diversity roles, and every time my health declined drastically because I was fighting a battle. I was in battle fatigue constantly every day.
Time out right there, Dr. Tyner. And I hate to interrupt you, but I'm going to interrupt you because there are some people that need to understand that fatigue that you experience, that self-doubt that you go through, that why am I even doing this? The feeling of being challenged by the people who look most like you in the process of doing that is an experience that many other practitioners feel, right?
Agreed.
I want people to understand what you're saying, and I wanted to stop for a moment because there's somebody out there that's young that's been tapped for a diversity position for no other reason than the way that they look. And they're going through these experiences that you and I have had and other practitioners have had. And I need to let them know that that's normal. What they're experiencing is something that many others before them had experienced. I apologize for interrupting you, but I wanted to put a pin in that right there so people can understand. Please continue.
No, it's teamwork. And I think that's worthy of that pin and that emphasis on that issue, because the reality of it is you have to be prepared for the longevity of your own personal mission and vision. And in addition to that, please, DEI and the work that you will do will be wonderful. I know, because many of us, our passion is there, our expertise is there, but I also want to make sure that you're doing something else simultaneously. Always focusing on your overall professional development, because you'll need multiple skill sets as well. So for instance, if you're doing DEI and you have a background in HR, continue to do your professional development in HR, because what we're starting to see, they're just starting to collect some of the data. The tenure around some of these DEI roles at the C-suite on the average is getting to be 2 to 3 years. What will you do after you talked about it? What will you do when you really get that call that you are no longer in the position, or they'll say you're not the right fit, or there's not the right alignment? What will happen to your career? So I want to make sure, if you're a DEI professional in the law, make sure that you have a practice area. Are you working in intellectual property? Are you working in employment law? I want you to do a both and here so you can have more versatility around what this is really about, which is change. So I would say make sure that you have your personal mission and vision at the forefront, but at the same time, preserve yourself, because this is a marathon. This is something that I oftentimes have to remind myself. I have to pass the baton to my students, to my children's children, to say that this work. And I had to say this recently at a lecture. They were asking me about all of the challenges that we're facing around police brutality, around challenges around the economy, all these things within the African-American community. But I had to remind them, this is over 400 years in the making. And you're asking me to resolve this in a 60-minute lecture.
Right.
Pieces and components, but we have to acknowledge the anchor of history that led us here to be able to redirect us for the future.
All right, Dr. Tyner, some things that we're going to talk about in the future, because I am definitely going to have you back on, and I hope you are willing to come back on. But a couple of things we're going to talk about in the future is one of the things about, you just talked about, if you're a diversity practitioner, keep honing your HR skills. One of the things I've talked about in my past podcasts is if you have a diversity department, your HR department is failing you, right? Because that's initially what they're there for, right? So that becomes part of the diversity person being C-suite adjacent, right? They're not really there. So in the future, we're going to tackle that one right there, okay? I promise. But the other thing is just really talking about where diversity has been versus where it is now, and why we haven't moved. So one day I want us to be able to really hone in and talk about that as well. But before we go, I am going to make sure that I send this to everyone that I know that's in this circle. And I just want you to be able to leave people with how to contact you, and what's the best way to get in touch with you.
Yes, you can visit my website, which is my name, ARTIKATYNER, artikatyner.com. And actually, we just added a new feature, a reading guide and discussion guide for the inclusive leader. It has the practical questions that you can bring into the workplace to help, like you've talking about, moving the needle. The questions and the conversations and the dialogues that we need to have, you can use in your employee resource group. You can use in your next C-suite meeting. Please download, use it. It's free of charge. It's my gift to you. You can also find me on social media on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter.
Time out, Dr. Tyner. If you are an influencer in your organization, if you are a corporate leader, stop trying to get this DEI stuff for free. Pay Dr. Tyner for what she brings to the table. So even though she says she has something free for you to download, you're not going to get as much value as if you incorporate her as a consultant and listen to her. Any diversity and inclusion consultant that's worth their salt, you want them at the table. Do not just pay lip service to this by downloading something from SHRM, and I love SHRM. I'm not speaking against SHRM, but don't just think that you can download a guide to help you do this. A very important part of this is having the conversation and really being open to the feedback that you receive. Would you say that's correct, Dr. Tyner?
I think is essential. So it's a learning journey, and it's an investment of time and resources, and includes the monetary resources to not just do educational experiences, but change the very fabric and culture of an organization.
You know what I think, Dr. Tyner? I think you and I are like that Obama and Key and Peele skit, right? Like, you're the very refined person. I need to be the person that be like, look, stop being cheap. Stop being cheap. Like, we're going to work on that, okay? So okay. I am going to pay the meter and park it right there. I want to thank you so much, and I can't wait till we do this again.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on.
Tune in each week as Reg Clark shows you how to demand and implement diversity and inclusion at your job. To hear more, check out his previous shows on ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com.